Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Tracy, for joining as well. This is a newer topic for us, so we're excited to dive into all things ESG, specifically through the lens of venture. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Mike Pruce. I am the founder and CEO of Visible. We build products for companies to provide updates to their investors and potential investors and other stakeholders, and a portfolio monitoring solution for investors to gather and collect data from their portfolio companies, get insights for that data either internally or share that externally with their investors or other stakeholders. I'm also joined by Tracy. Tracy is the director of ESG4VC. ESG is a nonprofit that's geared towards advisory and training with a mission to increase the adoption of ESG for venture funds and firms. And then she's also the head of ESG and global stakeholder engagement for 500 startups. And before that, she was the head of investor relations at Bamboo Capital, which is an impact fund. Anything I missed there, Tracy?
No, actually, I am now the executive director of ESG4VC and no longer with 500. So that would
okay. There we go. Very cool. Well, I'm gonna walk through the agenda, and if you guys have any questions, please let us know. You can pop into the Q&A here in Zoom, and we'll happy to answer those real time or towards the end. Belle and our team will be helping monitor those. We will record this webinar, so we usually send this out within 24 to 48 hours. And again, feel free to jump any questions into Zoom. So first of all, we're going to cover what is ESG, like why now and why for venture, what does it look like to incorporate ESG, thinking about fund team formation, due diligence, portfolio monitoring as it relates to ESG, fund reporting, and portfolio support. So I'm actually going to stop sharing because Tracy has been very kind to put together some really great content she'll walk us through. So Tracy, feel free to go ahead.
Okay. Can you see?
Yes.
All right. And are you seeing it full screen?
We are seeing more or less. If you click slideshow, it should be good to go.
Okay.
Yes, perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for having me talk about this. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've spent the last, just for context, 2.5 years working on at 500. I built out their ESG sort of policy and implementation of measurement and reporting and working with portfolio companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that experience and what happened there. So first, to start off with, I think just to kind of give a broad definition of ESG, which is that the way I see ESG is that it's a set of policies and practices that help investors and companies to manage their environmental, social, and governance risk. And I will talk more about that in a minute, what that means specifically. And it also is the purpose of ESG, I think, is also to identify opportunities for value creation as well. So not just a risk management tool, but also an opportunity to look at opportunities. So what does that mean in terms of breakdown? It's, environmental is looking at things like your carbon emissions, waste management, climate change, basically how you, as a company and a firm and a fund, perform as a steward of nature. And then on the social side, it's looking at companies, and again, on the firm and fund side as well, in terms of diversity and inclusion, the impact on communities, health and safety, and a whole host of other things. And then finally, governance, which probably many of you, if you're investors, know a lot about this, is around board diversity, transparency, and accountability, and things like executive pay. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about venture or ESG. When I talk about ESG for venture capital, the key difference here is that I think as the field has continued to grow and evolve, the main message here is that we really look at ESG through the lens of a company's stage of growth. So, younger, smaller startups may not have the same requirements with respect to ESG as later stage companies do. And, the goal with ESG4VC is to help to really kind of crystallize what are those stages and what needs to be measured when, because I know that's a big question for people. How does it compare to impact investing? Just another to give you some context for what is ESG or how I see ESG versus impact. So I spent almost a decade of my career on the impact investing side. And ESG, I see that more as something that gets applied across a portfolio. It's not meant to be sort of screen for the types of companies or a strategy per se. I think how that compares to impact is really designed to think about the end goal and the impact of the companies that you're investing in. So if you have a strategy around, water or climate or, even diversity these days, that to me would be considered an impact strategy. So you're filtering deals based on an impact criteria, and then you're measuring those companies based on that. The difference between that and ESG is that every company, regardless of the type of company, you're looking at sort of their environmental, their social, and their governance across the companies, and it's regardless of sector. So that's how I think about it. And why question, why now in venture capital? So as I mentioned, I've been working on this for about the last 2.5 years. I've seen a lot of momentum growing in the space and a lot more firms doing a lot of really cool things. So it's a very exciting time. I think there's still a lot of ground to cover. So why now? I think a lot of these things will make sense to everyone. Diversity, we talk a lot about this, especially in the venture space, but I'm not going to get into, talking about all of the stats associated with all of the demonstrated benefits, but I think, it's safe to at least, hopefully everybody agrees that there are benefits to having diverse teams and diverse cultures and diverse boards, et cetera. And that's a big topic of conversation. So it's getting a lot more visibility. Also, the next generation of talent, they want to work for companies with a mission. I think by and far, like all the surveys that we've done and we've talked to portfolio companies and founders, is that the one thing that really motivates employees is having some kind of engagement around a mission or a purpose beyond just the business. So that's one of the key drivers. Regulation and compliance, especially related to data privacy and protection. And I even go one step further to say that ethical tech is also getting a lot of momentum. There are a number of initiatives going on with respect to the unintended consequences and how do you plan for those with respect to tech. Responsible Innovation Labs is something I'll give a shout out to, is a project that General Catalyst has launched and is working on a set of standards around this. So I think we'll hear more about that. There's a number of these venture firms that are sort of getting together and trying to help sort of figure out what that would look like. And so I think there's more and more of this will be coming. And then finally, of course, the environmental impact, which, has a lot of the spotlight right now, but certainly I think with more recent regulation in the US and also in Europe, if you're fundraising in Europe, for example, you're going to get a lot of questions related to carbon measurement, and you're going to hear a lot about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then if that, finally, as I mentioned, sort of the regulation piece is key, because if you're a fund especially if you're a fund and you're raising in, Europe or even in the US now, as more regulation is being put on the table around disclosures, and the impact of that will not necessarily be directly to your fund, but certainly could be to your companies if they're suppliers of large corporations, for example, or public companies. In Europe, if you're fundraising there with SFDR, I think now it's becoming more and more of a filter that a number of pension funds and other LPs are looking at, wanting to make sure that you have some kind of ESG policy and practice in place. So those will be some of the impacts that you'll feel if you're on the fund side. And then again, on the fundraising, there's just more momentum around various initiatives that are trying to, again, sort of put forward some frameworks that are requiring disclosure and measurement, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but there's quite a lot of momentum going on there as well. So what does that mean in terms of integrating ESG into your GP operations? It's a question I get asked quite a lot. I'm gonna, as I mentioned earlier, what's coming down the pike is right now, UNPRI just went through a working session with LPs and GPs. They're going to announce in November a standardized due diligence questionnaire for venture capital around ESG. The kinds of things that they're really looking for are, related to, whether or not you have an ESG policy, and if so, what does that look like? Who's responsible for it? What's the accountability associated with it? Do you have any side letters or any formal commitments in terms of your LPA and your fund documents? They're looking for how you consider ESG risks and opportunities in a potential investment. They're going to be asking about post-investment. What does that look like? If you do identify sort of some challenges with a company, or you do identify that a company might have some potential risks around ESG, how are you going to manage those and stay on top of them? And then in terms of reporting and disclosure, do you sort of report on this on an annual basis? I think that will become more and more a part of the conversation, especially in 2023 when it comes to LPs.
Hey, Tracy.
Yeah.
What would an example be of like a perceived challenge or risk at the portfolio company level?
Oh yeah. So in particular around, I'll speak to the tech stuff because I think some of the climate stuff is a little bit still, you could break it down by.
Did we lose Tracy?
That I've talked with, or we had a screening questionnaire at 500 that don't have basic sort of GDPR or CCPA, and they aren't compliant with those things. So that's one thing. I think the other is having processes in place to sort of manage the risk of unintended consequences from the technology. So a lot of the product development teams are working really fast to get their products, up and running and tested and, growing their companies. But a lot of times they haven't stopped to think about what would it look like if something really bad sort of happened, if, there was some kind of unintended consequence, such as the stuff that you've seen with, various social networks. And so those are the kinds of things that you would look for potentially early on. And then the goal, I think right now in terms of where ESG is to not like penalize companies for that, because none of us are really, we don't know yet what good or best practices look like. So I think the goal right now is just try to start to have a conversation about what those things would look like. And I have some prompt questions that I'll share in a second that would highlight more of these risks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So part of the integration is having an ESG policy in place. And sometimes people feel like, or, GPs will feel like, okay, so it's a lot of work to put a policy in place. I'm not going to sort of discount how much effort it takes to think about like, what is material to your portfolio and your investments? What kind of, if you're investing in really early stage companies and you're taking a small minority ownership, like what risk exposure do you really have to, some of these potential risks? So from the policy helps you to define what that is and what's material, what you feel is material to your investment thesis. And then it also maps out like, what is the diligence? How do you integrate this into your diligence process? Who's responsible for it? What kind of actions, communications, et cetera. And same thing on the reporting and data collection side. And same thing on the governance, like how are you ensuring that the ESG is actively managed? So from a framework perspective, the policy is where you're doing a lot of the work, right? You're figuring out how it's material to your company. You're deciding how you're going to actually diligence it and what kind of questions you're going to ask, how you're going to report it, and then how you're going to make sure that you continue to improve on performance. So I think policy is the crux for me. What took the longest amount of time. The rest of it was just process and workflow, but the policy is really key. And the way I thought about the way I think about policy now, as opposed to when I first started with ESG implementation at 500. So 500 has many different funds, almost 3 billion in assets under management. We probably invested at about, a clip of 200 companies plus per year around the world. When I first put together the policy, it was very much, a checklist, almost exercise. But as I moved through having more conversations with LPs, and as we started to implement the process of integrating ESG into our diligence process, what I realized is that the policy is really this living document that should be like an output of the work that you're continuing to do and learn, especially in ESG for venture, because the knowledge and expertise is still growing and evolving. And you're going to want to continue to sort of, take inputs to your question about like, what are risks? I think we're still in the discovery phase of trying to identify what those are. So I think that the policy is really sort of shouldn't be the thing you do, and now I have an ESG policy, check the box. It's more of an ongoing sort of workflow, and it's an output and an ongoing input for ongoing development of measuring your ESG progress is how I would think about it. Some of the advanced practices around policies is, around incentives and tying, compensation or carry or other kinds of things to it. There's LPAs for sure. There's definitely, I think, more advanced practices will set ESG goals. So they want to make sure all their companies have, or, the teams are, all have some kind of representation of diversity. For example, might be a goal. They have a climate policy and they're measuring specific things with respect to carbon, or they're looking at net zero kind of commitments. And so these are some of the more kind of advanced practices. And there are some firms out there that are doing some really cool, innovative things around ESG. And Base 10 is actually one of them. I would highlight what they're doing. They're doing some very cool things. The other example I'll mention is Obvious Ventures. So they just came out with their sort of ESG, or their second version of their World Positive Term Sheet example. And I think that it's a really good way to think about how to integrate some of the ESG into your discussions with your portfolio companies. Atomico is another great example of a firm that does early on in their investment process will sort of have a lot of conversations around mission, vision, value, talking about unintended consequences, asking questions around sort of how do you hire, how are you thinking about hiring, what are you thinking about in terms of employee development, these kinds of things. And these become sort of guiding questions that they incorporate into both their diligence and then in terms of setting KPIs for the companies as well. So integrating ESG into the team. So one thing I would say is, so what happens if you don't have an ESG lead? A lot of firms don't have that right now, and is that a necessary sort of function or role to have? I think for smaller teams, it's probably not necessary to have an ESG lead. I think for, especially if you're investing, in 10 companies a year or less, it's probably something that your team can share responsibilities for. And I think the ESG policy can definitely be the sort of guidepost for that kind of thing. But in the case where you are a larger firm or you want to really have some ESG expertise in-house, the way it typically sort of works is, for example, at 500, I wrote the policy, revising and updating it on an ongoing basis. So I'm sort of the ESG expert in-house. We give questionnaires, ESG questionnaires to all the companies. I'm part of the diligence process, so I'm reviewing their answers. We're not screening companies based on their answers, but really more trying to identify where there are gaps. So if, a lot of companies say they don't have employee manuals, or they don't have non-discrimination policies, or they don't have processes for diversity and inclusion hiring, then I know that's an area that I can help work with them on. So what happens is I would, in this case, be the ESG lead. I would review what they've written in their ESG questionnaire, and then I would inform the investment team, and we would have a sort of discussion about that, and then would make note of what we would like to see in terms of sort of longer term goals for the company. And then on an annual basis, I'm reporting that to the senior leadership and to our LPs and to our board. So an ESG lead can play the role of oversight and collaboration on what it looks like to do assessment. I definitely worked with the investment team to fine tune what it would look like to do diligence and what it meant, and also the general counsel. So that would be the role that the ESG lead would play. But the policy, if you go through the work of putting together the policy, that can also be your kind of go-to guide in lieu of having an ESG lead right away. I just wrote down very quickly sort of stages of investment and responsibilities is something that I included when I was putting together the process on who would be accountable and at what stage and what phase of diligence. And I think this is going to be sent to you, so you'll get a chance. I won't go through this with you in too much detail. So what does that look like to integrate ESG into due diligence? So first, there's a number, IFC, the UN Global Compact, there's a number of sort of exclusion lists that exist that have been pretty standardized so far. And it has, to do with, child labor, human rights, pornography, gambling, things of that nature. We did screen companies based on the exclusion list, and sometimes LPs will have even additional exclusions that they want you to incorporate. And especially if you're looking to raise money from development banks, they will typically have their own sort of additional exclusions. So they want to make sure that you're not investing in anything that sort of is on this exclusion list. So once you get past exclusion, what are some of the other kinds of questions to your earlier question about what kinds of risks do you try to identify? So in the case of 500, I put together it was a total of 30 questions. I think 12 of them pertain to exclusion questions, but the other questions were related to things like the fair treatment of workers, like, do you have a formal contract of employment with everyone? Is there a human resources policy in place? These kinds of things. Do you have a process for protecting sensitive data? Some really, I think, pretty sort of base level stuff. And again, this was not designed to penalize anybody, but to really get a sense for where companies were in their own journey around human resource, diversity and inclusion, and also were they even starting to think about tracking, monitoring energy and water source consumption. So this is an example of questions that might be asked in sort of a diligence process. And for companies that are later stage, I think, it can be even more detailed, because once you get to the process where you're actually having a lot of customers and your products out in the world, I think the sort of questions around unintended consequences become sort of greater, and the questions around environmental impact also sort of become more necessary as you grow. And diversity and inclusion. So these questions only grow kind of over time. But the good news is that you probably already ask about a lot of these things. I think when we started the process of integrating more ESG as a layer into our diligence process at 500, because of the volume of investments that we do, I had to make sure that it wasn't something that was going to be more onerous for the companies and or the diligence team. And so what I did is I just said, okay, let's look at what we're already asking, and let's figure out how we start to integrate more of these kinds of questions to have if you're looking at things like, oh, I have product assessment there. Sorry. The first one is team assessment. you're already sort of figuring out how the team works together because you've probably, diligenced at least a few people on the team. You can see what their communication is like. You're starting to assess what their values and vision is. So these kinds of things can be sort of talking ways to have a lot of this as a discussion with them to find out where companies are and their thinking around some of these things. And I think you're probably already doing a lot of that already. So quickly, again, the implementation process, this is just one example. I would do this questionnaire. I would review it. I would look for opportunities where, companies were missing sort of certain aspects that we felt were sort of minimum requirements. I would provide education and training. So I would do a host of webinars and bring in toolkits and other things that would help people to, or help companies to integrate things like the ethical OS checklist, diversity and inclusion handbooks and manuals for sourcing and hiring, a number of those kinds of things. And then annually, I would look at what was the portfolio overall? How is it performing? And did that change year on year? And I would look at examples. We worked very closely with a number of companies where we put more money into companies. We would have more detailed conversations and more customized kind of recommendations on what they could do. So I would use those as case studies and learnings for the portfolio for our founders and also for our LPs. So portfolio monitoring, just what I mentioned, this is an example of, this is 100 companies, I think that this represented for the first year. So some of the questions that are on the questionnaire, as you can see, more than 70% of or 72% of the companies did not monitor their energy and water consumption. So I saw that as an opportunity to sort of bring in outside both service providers, but also, those companies and consultants who work with smaller earlier stage companies to help them start to think about how they can start to manage in a cost-effective way. And things like, do they have, are they compliant with national employment regulations, these kinds of things, of course, I want to see a 93.5%, and those other sort of 6.5%, I'm definitely looking with more detail about why it is that they're not. But this is an example of what I would look at on an annual basis and then start to compare companies on an ongoing basis. Now, with 500, because again, we did a lot of minority investments. I'm, maybe by year 3, they're not going to be required to report, or they're maybe, not going to be as likely to report information as quickly as they would have in the first year or when we're first writing the check. So, for me, I was looking at the first 3 years of our investment and looking at the change on year over year to see if my education and training strategy was working. So that's what I was kind of ultimately measuring to see if I was making any kind of having a positive impact on ESG integration. Another example was on a quarterly basis, we looked at founder diversity. And I think there's a number of other now YC and a number of others report on this, but diversity was definitely at the forefront of our discussions. And so looking at how we've progressed over time and benchmarking that to the industry, which in this case, is not really saying a lot because the industry has a long way to go. But this definitely gave us a sense of both. I looked at the actual companies we invested in and what the founder diversity was, but also the pipeline of companies as well. And some people will say, well, you can't ask demographic information. And we didn't. What we did is we did an anonymous sort of survey after the fact. And so we had a pretty good hit rate of, I would say, about 80% completion with our pipeline companies. And so I asked them demographic information, and that's how I compared sort of, what our pipeline looked like versus what we were actually funding. But just another example of how to monitor and think about monitoring the diversity. And then, of course, there's also Visible, which I have to say, I went through and looked through. What I love about what you're doing at Visible is I would have loved to actually use your platform instead of having created my, just using a Survey Monkey. So I wasn't particularly sophisticated about it, but I love that you can customize this, that, this is fantastic. And I would have used something like this for sure. So once you figure out what your ESG sort of metrics are, having a place where companies can go on an ongoing basis to fill it out is a definite necessity for ESG, and a super sort of helpful thing to be able to do with your portfolio.
We would love to have you. Hopefully you get in the future.
So on the fund reporting side, just quickly, I would again sort of do this annual report. And because we had just started a couple of years ago, typically what I would do then the next year is show kind of progression and show how the portfolio is changing over time, and if it is or isn't, and why isn't it. And that to me would be my measure of how I would try to determine what I would sort of focus on as ways to improve it, whether I needed to update the policy and include different questions, where was I getting more questions from founders, these kinds of things. But this would be sort of an annual check-in. And then also there's third-party reviews. So we did work with Visible.vc, which I highly recommend. There are a couple of different areas where we went to outside external consultants that were quite helpful in helping us to identify like what are best practices and how do we know if it's like quote unquote good enough. So they looked at processes across like recruitment and HR and our policy and how we did deal flow. So I think it was 2 sets of maybe 2-hour interviews with our investment team and others to find out like what our policies and processes look like. And then what they did was, because they're collecting this data from the industry, they would sort of break down and tell us like what are we do, how are we doing relative, to the industry, what could we improve on, and it was both helpful and to have an external validation point to say, okay, here's our North Star, this is what we can improve on. And also helpful for the ESG lead to have an external, sort of validation point to say this is what we can improve on. So this, I think the benchmarking and the sort of external certification and that field is growing and growing now. And so I think there'll be more of this in the future. As I mentioned, the portfolio support, I did probably with the help of my program manager, Courtney Weinstein. She really helped to put together a really solid program of more than 30 webinars and toolkits, and really kind of started talking to everybody that we could that was doing anything in this space. And there are a lot of people who are working on this. And so we were really privileged to be able to have a lot of them come and talk to our portfolio companies and provide them with this ongoing sort of education and resource. And it's on the 500 site still sort of under ESG. So these will hopefully be out there and be beneficial to others as well. And then, as I mentioned, I launched ESG4VC. We were almost close to closing the grant funding contract right now, or else then I'll make an announcement about who funded us. But it grew out of, there was a group of us for almost 2 years that just kept coming together, trying to figure out how we can standardize in VC, ESG, and make it easier and quicker for people to be able to accelerate adoption. And so what I decided to do is to take that learning, put it into sort of a couple of different workshops, which we're launching in January, make it, very affordable and really sort of geared towards emerging fund managers and others who want to get started with ESG and want to kind of just, get through the noise and start implementing. So that's what it is. If you're interested, you can contact me. You can sign up for our newsletter. We'll be sharing more information, but that's what I'm doing next.
Very awesome. I think that was the last slide. Is that right? Yeah, awesome. Tracy, that was awesome. We got a ton of questions, which is great. If anyone has questions, keep them coming through. I might go with the newest question first. This might be the Holy Grail one, and probably a hard answer, if not impossible. How do we produce an overall ESG score for each portfolio company, or is such a metric even possible? That's from Alex. Oh, you're back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you hear the question?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
Okay. All good. This is from Alex. How do we produce an overall ESG score for each portfolio company? Is such a metric even possible to calculate? Like, is there a way to quantify?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I started there. I started with the idea that we could do that. I think it's possible to do. I think it would take quite a bit of work to do. So when I mentioned I did these 30 questions, those questions are mostly yes, no questions, right? So it's quick to do. It gives me a sense of where companies are. I was going to start to put weighting towards some of those things. But when I started to think about, well, what's the exposure in terms of risk with our ownership percentage, then how do I sort of think about the weighting of those things and then assign sort of a value to that? It was a bit difficult, but for me to kind of figure out and get it past our GC, but I think it's possible to do. I think, there are probably a lot of smart people on this call that could figure out how to do that and make that part of your own process. I have a sort of more balanced scorecard kind of approach where I do low, medium, high on the risks for companies that we're doing follow-on investment in their slightly later stage. And I do use that as a discussion sort of tool with the companies, but it doesn't have numbers associated with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, is ESG, would you say it's a portfolio kind of holistic approach versus every single one of my companies needs to have a certain score or
I think
a balanced scorecard?
Well, I think all the companies, you could look at it. I think the answer is both. You need to have probably both. So your investment thesis, whatever that is, so it's investing in, tech companies, or, SaaS companies, you're going to want to understand the risk associated with each one of the companies in your portfolio. So you would want to ask them and understand what those risks are. And then could you pull it up to the portfolio level? Yes, that's what I was doing with sort of the data for 500. But you need to understand what each one of those companies, looks like in terms of its risk and also the value creation opportunities. So you have to kind of do both. And part of that also at the firm level, I mean, we talk a lot about the companies and what the companies do, but I think there's also, part of the focus at the firm level is around diversity and hiring and development opportunities. So there's still a piece of the firm that you have to be thinking about also in terms of carbon and footprints and things like that. So I think it's tough to just do it at the portfolio level. I think that would be maybe this year or the next 2 years, you could probably, LPs would maybe be okay with that. But I think, they'd want to have more detailed information about companies going forward.
Drake wrote in, great to be here. Tracy, how did the portcos respond to inbound requests for data? What did that process feel like?
Yeah. So that yes, no thing was really critical because when I first started, it was 50 questions. And then the investment team told me there was no way that was gonna happen. So I narrowed it down and also wanted to get it under 15 minutes. But again, I think, it's important to say that was for early stage companies. I think if you're doing, you're making 5 investments, 10 investments a year, you're going to want to have more detailed discussions with the companies. And then the question is sort of how do you capture that information where you're having these discussions about when I the obvious term sheet, the world positive term sheet questions, because they do get into trying to understand what are your going to be your hiring. Maybe you're a company that doesn't have any diversity on your team, or you have a low percentage of diversity. You'll want to know from companies what are they planning to do? And then you're going to want to track that, because it won't be enough just to ask them, what are you planning on doing? You're going to have to be accountable for not just asking them, but making sure that they're actually doing it. So I think there's, definitely it's an ongoing negotiation because companies do get asked for a lot of information. And especially like early stage companies are getting asked for tons of information. So in my case, I tried to make it really sort of straightforward, but my thesis around ESG integration was that I could help companies get educated and start to integrate earlier on. So I think with later stage companies, there might be a slightly different approach, and you will need to have more detailed discussions. The companies didn't really push back too much but I will say, partly because, I was the last stop on the diligence train. So they were keen to get my questionnaire filled out.
Yeah, it's an easy carrot when there's a check on the line.
Yeah, but follow-up,
Yeah.
this is what I mean about the data follow-up. I think that you could have a lot of people assigned to just following up with companies depending on what your investment strategy is.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Drake, we not necessarily as ESG, but just putting my founder hat on and Visible hat on. I think like as frictionless as possible for any kind of data request, and providing some unit level back to the founder. I think it always is a great way to get adoption. So if that's being able to share benchmark data back that we saw from earlier in the presentation, or resources like, hey, I don't have an employee handbook yet. Hey, here's some ways you can get started with that. I think if you can actually give a unit of value back to the founder, you're way more likely to get a response. And then and founders love benchmark data too. Like they love to see where they stand within other companies. All right, we got one from Anonymous, but wrote in, any good practice for finding financially material ESGs? SB financial materiality is suitable for conventional businesses, but not so much for VC. Do you recommend running a survey for external and internal census? Thank you.
Okay. I think I know what they're getting at in terms of so one of the sort of more well-known SASB is one of the more well-known sort of metrics that gets used on the public company side. What I did to kind of figure out what would be material is I sort of worked backwards. I took SASB as like the end goal of, a public company exit, and kind of worked backwards to say what would be then relevant at the earliest stages. And this is the point of ESG4VC. So I'm glad you asked this question, is really to take all of that learning that we did. And there's another group called Venture ESG that also is working on this as well. And basically mapping it to stages and saying this is what would be a materially relevant question at this stage. So for us, for example, at 500, the earliest stage, we're investing, maybe 200,000 in a company for, a small percentage of equity. They probably they're pre-product market fit. They maybe have 10 employees, probably mostly contractors and 2 founders and are getting paid. And so in that instance, I'm just looking to say, are they starting to think about how to integrate practices? Are they starting to think about how they're going to hire? Like, are there small little things, the employee manual, the sort of non-discrimination policy, are there little things that they're starting to put on their agenda to start to integrate this kind of thinking into their company earlier on? Because it's going to be more expensive to do it when they get to 100, 200, 3,000, employees. And so that's what I'm really looking at in terms of materiality. Are they starting to do these things very early on? And to your earlier point, I give them the tools, and then I'm measuring to see if they're making any progress. I think the same is probably true as you move into Series A or Series B. You're starting to add a little bit more to that. Now you have more employees. You're going to want to start figuring out what is going to be your diversity hiring process, and what does that look like, and how do you know if it's good enough? Those kinds of things I think are critical, especially at earlier stages. So there are things you can apply, but it's not out there in the public domain. It's not the sort of public disclosure stuff, unfortunately. But stay tuned for ESG4VC.
Awesome. Matt wrote in, where do we get the DDQ? I'm going to paste this one here. That's from the ilpa.org. I think those are like a monster DDQ. But any other resources we can point some folks to for due diligence questionnaires?
Yeah, so I look at the ILPA or UNPRI has a DDQ for private equity on ESG. The one they're doing for VC, they will be releasing with ILPA in November. So I think stay tuned for that. They'll, I think they're just finalizing the sort of last tweaks to it. But I think the PE guide is actually probably a relatively good guide. There are some differences, obviously, for VC, but it really is fundamentally about what are you doing? What are you measuring or thinking about measuring? You know, it's more of a discussion point than it is like hard and fast metrics, except for when it comes to diversity. I think the ILPA has put together a 2.0 on diversity, and they're getting a lot more specific around both on the firm side and the company, the portfolio company side of things as well. But I'd start with UNPRI and look at their private equity due diligence questionnaire.
Awesome. Yeah, related to DDQs, like we had a question like, how have you seen the demand for ESG policies coming from LPs change over the years? Like, I don't know if you have any quantifiable data, but is it like, 10% of institutions going to 25? Like, what is the, have you seen anything anecdotally change and shift over the years?
Yeah, it's shifting. I mean, I think the UNPRI focus on now, I think it was a group of, on the GP side, I think it was, I want to say it was 80 or something. And on the I could be wrong, on the LP side, I think it was like 40 or 60, something like that, that was part of the working group. I was getting on a regular basis, especially through intermediaries. So the Schroders, Hamilton Lanes, the others of the world, I was getting, so I sat on the investor relations side as well, interfacing for fundraising. I got a lot of due diligence questionnaires related to ESG, and that started happening in the last year or so, I think.
Yeah. Awesome. Matt wrote in, what do you think about projectframe.how? It's a framework for climate KPI tracking of early stage companies.
I don't know. I don't know that one. I know Leaders for Climate Action was the one that we started working with for our portfolio. So I can't really comment on that.
Okay. Let's see, what other questions we got here? Here's another one. How would you approach the integration of ethical guidelines when VCs are evaluating, for example, artificial intelligence startups?
That's a good one. There is so much going on in that space right now. Also, UNPRI just did a workshop on this with somebody that we had come in and talk to our portfolio companies. And I should also mention our portfolio companies and our founder retreats. One of the topics that they were very keen to learn about and wanted to know more about was this question of ethical tech and how do you start the process of integration into your product development sort of life cycles. So I would look at UNPRI. They're doing quite a bit of, sort of education on the investor side of things. There are also a number of different groups. Oh gosh, I wish I remember them off the top of my head. I will send them to you so you can share it with this. But there are lots of groups that are doing great work. I think when we talk to founders, and one of the things that we use as a toolkit was the Ethical OS toolkit that Omidyar had put out some years ago. That was led by, I think, Paula Goldman, who's now at Salesforce and who's their chief ethical and humane officer. She's amazing. So there's a lot of good tools and thinking out there, but it's evolving quickly.
Yeah. And then I think we'll wrap with this final question here. Any other practical advice or tips you can do to start integrating ESG within our portfolio today?
Yeah, I think, the basic kind of questions about diversity are like the low-hanging fruit stuff, right? A lot of times what happens, or what I saw happen, is founders they want to do all of these things, right? But they don't know when or how to get started. And they need a little prodding usually to start thinking about it. So, having them think through like, okay, your next 10 hires, like, what is that gonna what is that going to look like? Even if it's just an agenda item that you have, you're talking to them, once a month or quarterly about these kinds of things. I think starting to have those conversations and demonstrating that you care as an investor is like the key part to this, right? Like there's, are you tracking your carbon footprint? Well, they can say, yes, we are. And here's how we do it. Or it might lead to, no, we aren't, but we'd like to. How could we get started? I think just starting to ask some of these kinds of questions, and the low-hanging fruit stuff are going to be, non-discrimination policies, like the basics, right? Employee manuals. How do you think about those? I think the bigger questions around AI and ethical tech and integrating that into your product development, those are, still I would say in process and being iterated on now, but we'll soon have a set of questions that will help to guide investors and talking to their portfolio companies, and likewise help guide the founders in terms of how to integrate them. We just aren't there yet. So I would highly recommend looking at groups like Venture ESG, certainly ESG4VC. I'm, putting together a number of tools and checklists and questions that hopefully will be helpful. And I'm would be excited to share them with anybody who's interested. We spent a lot of work, time doing a lot of the work to help companies or founders and investors get started with this. And so there's more tools to come. But if you look at things like, the 500 ESG report, for example, at the back end of it is the whole questionnaire, the 30 questions that get asked. Those are places that you can get started.
Awesome. Perfect. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us. You're clearly an expert. It's been wonderful having on and sharing this with our community. We will send this recording out. We'll send the deck out. A lot of the resources we'll mention, we'll put in the write-up as well. And thanks for everyone for joining. It's been great, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.